Thanks very much. So as John said, I'm Dave Frampton. I run a business at Cisco focused on policy and context-based access control. Some of you in the room may have had association with our flagship offer around the identity services engine. It's primarily at the network layer, but I think as you'll see, we'll spend some time today talking about a much kind of broader topic that we've stumbled across at the network layer, which is really trying to answer a couple of questions, which we'll briefly touch on in this session, around a transition that's going on between the traditional role and group-based identity, as you've heard across the sessions these last couple of days, to a more attribute and contextually rich sense of identity. And these couple of questions, as they relate to access control, are number one, is the pleasure worth the pain? Because a lot of you who've had experience with this transition and its various phases at various layers of the IT stack know that it's a very difficult problem to solve. There's just inherent fragmentation on many layers, sort of in the tech stack and sort of business interests, the vendor community. And so just look briefly at, is this kind of inevitable that we fight through that pain and get there? And then second, if it is, sort of look at 2 or 3 different models of how people are trying to attack that complexity and that fragmentation, and sort of suggest a hypothesis for one of the 3 that looks like it shows some early promise, and then we'll close with a call to action. So first, as backdrop, I think for those of you who were in the room previous, there was a good sort of summation that people are thinking about identity as it relates to access control, both from an offensive and a defensive perspective. Defensive from a security standpoint, but an offensive thing about new services and value that can be added to users when this richer sense of identity is known. So to start on the defensive end of it, I think it's very, very clear as those of you who track evolutions in the security industry that access control is certainly necessary, but not nearly sufficient to protect assets in the emerging environment. On the other hand, raising the bar on access control can be thought of as a mandatory first step for securing assets in the new environment. Think Target. For those of you that aren't familiar with the recent break in Target, this is contractor's credentials were stolen by a group of hackers, and he happened to work in the HVAC area. So this is air conditioning, heating, and building administration and all this. So they used his credentials to get into the network and then migrate there into the point of sale terminals, install some malware, so on and so on and so on, and eventually getting the credit card numbers that I think you all heard about in the news. And when you think about this, from a security perspective, you could ask some basic questions. One is, why should the HVAC contractor have access to all of the resources on the network and be able to get to point of sale terminals? 2 is, if the HVAC contractor is remote and off-site, shouldn't we have some additional security safeguards there? So from a security perspective, if you're thinking about like the richer sense of identity, the context around his access, the attribute, what was his role? What should he have access to? Was he on-prem? Was he off-prem? What device was he accessing the network from? Once he got onto the network, what should he be able to access? So sort of the going-in thesis on is the pleasure worth the pain? We're certainly have to get there from a defensive and security perspective, because there just has to be some segmentation and analog striation of people's access rights to raise the quality of the first layer of defense from an access control perspective. So as we walk through, we'll just go through fairly straightforward, a little bit more on this pleasure-pain piece. We'll talk about getting the context that you need in distributed network environments. Part of the struggle of this attribute and context-based rich sense of identity is it's easy to get in some places, much harder in others. Talk through a specific example of IAM systems that are now starting to use telemetry from the network layer to enrich the services that they offer. Some of them, I think, demonstrated in parts of the floor here at the show. And then we'll talk about a little bit where this goes as cloud architectures and SDN architectures evolve, and close it up with a call to action. I think the one observation I'd make on all of this is that I'm from Cisco. We look at this from the network layer. I think if there's anything that we've stumbled across which just begs for building bridges across the layers of the IT stack, across application, user, device, and network. It's certainly this area of the richer sense of identity based on attribute and context. And I think you'll see that theme as we go through. So we talk about target. You might ask, like, well, okay, so look, we've all heard anecdotal access control examples where dire consequences were experienced because the front door was left open. Is the traditional role really that bad? I mean, certainly, the sense of role and group and user and password and some very simple coarse-grained segmentation of what is sensitive and what is not is how the world has operated for a long time. It's not just target and it's not just an isolated incident. I think you see the quote there from the Verizon security report is about 90% of most breaches, at least in their first instantiation, are traced back to fairly brittle and loose access control. But also think about other verticals, not just retail and stealing credit cards, but think about the financial services industry. There's a tremendous amount of resources now being spent in thinking about geolocation and what impact that should have on access rights, both at a network layer and at an application layer. A great example is consumer device with approved security certificate by executive, but located in China, Russia, or Brazil. Should there or should there not be changes in the access control policy based on this richer sense of context around the identity and the chain of context that you could create around the session that is being started. There's tremendous sensitivity at a data level on where data resides and where it can reside from a regulatory perspective. So what data people are trying to access is an important piece of context in addition to just the traditional source of identity. So you can imagine what the ideal state would be. Just leap ahead 9 steps, and you'd like to be able to take not just the who, why, where, what, when, which are the basics, but I think as the speaker was talking to from the survey in the last session, you'd like to take a sense of risk, of reputation, maybe of destination, of source, of data within application. Ideally, you'd have a very analog sense and a very robust context chain around which you could form a policy and be very fine-grained about what action you could take on that. Not just you can or can't access an app and you can or can't do these broad behaviors within an app, but can you or can you not access this specific piece of data within this app? If there is kind of a holy grail that most of the architects within both security and IAM are working towards, it goes along the lines of this picture. So thinking about that and thinking about the pressures in financial services, the pressures in retail, but also how cloud changes this. And this is a theme of many sessions in the summit here. This enriches the sources of context. It enriches the sort of destinations where that context needs to get to. So if we take it as a given that the pleasure is worth the pain, that we're going to have to punch through and get here, we start looking about the problem of how do you exchange this context and these attributes across the various layers of the IT stack and the systems that need to consume them and publish them. So think about context as sort of the currency of the realm, but think about all these different layers of the IT stack that both are sources of context, but also destinations of context. So somebody may have device telemetry, but they're lacking sort of threat intelligence. Somebody may have fairly granular intelligence on the device, but have a very loose sense of the actual identity. So you think about everybody has a chain, but parts of their chain link are missing, and parts of their chain link are brittle. What you really need to figure out is if we're going to have a horizontal service that spans all of our geos, all of our topologies within the prem, and then spans out to hybrid cloud environments, we're going to need to figure out some way to create some mechanism for exchange across this. And some of these mechanisms, since you have to go across device, user, network, and app, are going to involve exchange between layers of the stack and systems and vendors that don't normally talk to each other, not in any kind of natural way. And only then do you sort of get the complete picture of the context that you need to solve the problems that we identified. So think about this, from a, how might we approach solving this exchange problem? We'll look at 3 different methodologies that you might think about. So first is, let's create some APIs. And we'll make those structured, and they'll be published, and they'll be open, and we'll create ecosystems, and we'll do partner engineering. And this is sort of a conventional approach. There's a couple of things that jump out immediately. One, remember that a lot of this context exists in very different layers of the IT stack. So in many cases, it's not natural for APIs to either be published or consumed from the application layer to the device layer, or from the data layer to the network layer, as an example. The other thing to think about in the vendor APIs is there's an advantage in that instead of solving everything for everybody, it sort of forces people to find where the synergy and value is, so that there's goodness in that. But there's also this sort of odd overlay logic in these API networks of vendors who like working with each other because they don't compete in as many areas. There's also the sort of sense of scale. You want this to be horizontally broad, so you want to have fairly broad coverage and not be forced to pick only the vendors that participate in the APIs. And then finally, just from a raw scalability perspective, I think you sort of look at the security and then the sort of throughput scale and the volume of this context exchange, point-to-point models, where you're sort of trying to stitch together a point-to-point mesh in order to exchange this. In addition to being incomplete, they're not a terribly scalable way to deal with this. And you also end up sort of relying on upgrades across like multiple vendors, different versions of APIs, and obviously standards kind of loom in the background. So it's a tough road to go if you don't have any better solution and you feel like you're dealing with close cousins. It's definitely a way to go. The other approach, which normally you would just dismiss out of hand and say, sorry about this. Let's go back one here. All right. The other approach you might usually sort of dismiss out of hand is, well, we could just build some in-house glue that puts this together. And the reason it shouldn't be dismissed now is there's actually a huge amount of energy going on right now in the industry, taking analytics based on big data systems and then feeding those into various IT systems with some general notions of reaping the intelligence across large sets of data and metadata to improve the efficacy of IT. And so there is, particularly in the upper end of the market, the enterprise space, a great number of companies that have this very idea that they would like to actually solve that big jumble of spaghetti in the middle with some middleware. Obviously, you get good customization out of that, and you get tailoring of the use case. You also can just drill in on the subparts of the problem that you're interested in. But I think many find that the cost is prohibitive. The sort of timelines of these projects also tend to be multi-year, so the sort of move fast and iterate to build momentum is not there. And then the last thing to think about from this perspective is, if you need changes on the vendor side, then you're sort of left with having to influence multiple vendors, some of whom react well and are receptive, others of whom in the same kind of product or offer category, application offer category, don't choose to. So this one, I think, we'll see a lot of interesting and very highly customized and high-end solutions in this area, but not sure it's the approach for the mass of the market. So third approach. Here, you might think about the idea of a context sharing fabric that you could use to connect multiple vendors, either within one layer of the IT stack or across separated layers of the IT stack, where they could exchange context. And you might imagine, to get beyond some of the problems of the API mesh that we talked about a couple of slides ago, you might think about a publish and subscribe model where the sort of sources of context are able to selectively publish, and the consumers of context are able to selectively consume. So suppose we're talking about context around device. So you want to know what type of device is it? Is it Apple or Android? What operating system it's running for a particular user in a particular session? You have some people know that information. Other people, like let's say the firewall, would really like to consume that information. They don't have an easy way of tailoring their rules to be specific for a consumer device. So you might imagine a source and a destination of context connecting over this open exchange that would be open so that multiple vendors within categories and then across categories of IT could participate in this. So we think about the notion of having that publish and subscribe model and also the benefits that might have on scale. So instead of storming everybody with all the information and then selectively filtering out for groups of vendors that work together, you create an open exchange and let people publish kind of into the commons, and everybody who joins the context exchange sort of increases the efficacy of the exchange. Then finally, think about this in the sense of that sharing and consuming context has to be sort of fundamental as a part of the exchange mechanism that you would have, because some people have almost the reciprocal needs. One person knows identity but not device, the other person knows device and not identity, and then there's, you can imagine all around the chain kind of similar type complementary meshes that can be created here. You'd have to obviously standardize it, and it'd have to obviously be fairly lightweight, because you're not going to have everybody build some heavyweight sort of front end to their systems in order to participate. So think about sort of if you go down that path, which has lots of advantages and it seems to address the drawbacks of the other two, but on the other hand, it's slow and might rely on standards. So if you think about what that might look like, there are early instantiations of these exchanges that exist in parts of the IT infrastructure. And we're calling out one specific example that's very relevant to the conference here, which is the old way and the new way thinking about two attributes of identity and access management now that are currently in a state of evolution. One, I think the survey in the last session called it out, is identity and access management systems want a more robust sense of what device someone is using and what's the profile and posture of that device. They were sort of sniffing at web traffic and sticking cookies on and all this is sort of a very crude way to get at this information. So that's one big use case, that people want to roll out services that provide you layers of either value creating services, as the previous speaker said, or a higher sense of security because you know what device it is it consumer or not. The other one's very interesting, which is using previously authenticated devices and sessions at the network layer to presume authorization at the app layer. So you can imagine sort of a zero sign-on type environment where as long as the device is already registered, authenticated, the session's established, then you can use that as sufficient authentication at the identity and access management layer, even in a cloud context. So this is sort of, these efforts are underway. There's actually vendors participating here, Cisco only one, others that are starting to develop these. You'll see more as the calendar year progresses, as people begin to roll out these systems in some scale. But what's very clear is these context exchange mechanisms that are being built to actually create these systems across vendor boundaries. They're hard, it's slow, there's a lot of debate in the standards bodies, but they are really an essential way to get by some of the limitations that we talked about a little bit earlier on. So think about, talked a little bit earlier about how cloud and its sort of impact on the topologies affects this whole problem space. And the immediate one that jumps out is, I think, many of the vendors here experience very viscerally is, to some degree, we have a fairly rich set of authentication mechanisms that have been built out in the traditional on-prem infrastructure. I mean, they apply to most of the apps. There's plugins and APIs that have been built so that you can actually do some fairly sophisticated amount of attribute and context-based authentication at multiple layers on-prem. You sort of go back down the chutes and ladders game pretty significantly as soon as you start getting a meaningful number of applications and data hosted in the cloud. You sort of like, it's kind of a wrinkle in time. You go back 5 years, and then you sort of have to slowly build back all of that sense of rich context that was very easy to get in an on-prem environment, and just becomes much more difficult as you're trying to spray it across multiple cloud providers from a SaaS perspective in particular. So just there's good news and bad news here. I mean, the good news is the value of the solution is going to go up dramatically as the value of context goes up dramatically, dealing with all of that diversity off-prem. The bad news is, it is a challenge to imagine exchanging that context across that environment. And then finally, think about the sort of influence that the transitions in the network layer have on this problem. And there's a great deal of centralization and orchestration now that's being posited for controlling and orchestrating and provisioning network services. I think once this architecture gets some momentum, the next sort of layer down is how do we share information and context across these multiple orchestration systems? Because if you can't do that, then you'll just end up in the same verticalized trap that those systems were invented to deal with, to start with. And so I think both of these trends are, obviously cloud well underway. I think SDN less so, but over the next 3 to 4 years, I think you'll see both the pleasure and some of the pain increase fairly dramatically in this area to get a horizontal and consistent sense of that broader identity around context and attribute. So just to sum up and close, you think about getting from here to there as an industry. You think about sort of where you sit. If you're an IT department, I think the thing to do is push vendors to get out of this hoarding of context mentality and to participate in some of these context exchanges and reward them as they go down the learning journey, because oftentimes there's not an immediate return for them to do it. They sort of participate in a broader ecosystem. So that's sort of from an IT perspective. The vendor perspective, it's just do your research. There are people kind of getting out ahead of the curve, taking a non-intuitive and open approach to sharing information which maybe previously you thought was just inherently valuable within your proprietary system boundaries. And I think there are some emerging standards that sort of think about adopting sooner rather than later. And from a thought leadership perspective, just think about the white space that's possible here. There are concepts in fraud prevention that could be brought to network access control. There are concepts in identity and access management that can be used in device security. If we can create this sort of information flow and exchange of context across these diverse boundaries, there really are a whole new set of services, both value creating and securitizing, that can be created as we go down this path. So as I said, there's many more announcements I think that are upcoming in the next 6 months in this area. I think we're about at the end of the time window here, but I'll certainly stay around for a few minutes just outside the door. If you have questions, you want to talk about this further, and then happy to also connect the dots with other vendors and thought leaders in the industry who are thinking about this same problem over time. So thank you very much. Okay.